hard to replicate the wealth of the feudals. If you go to a wealthy capitalist in France's home, it'll be surrounded by 14th century French antiques. Why? Because the ideal for a French capitalist who earns money is to recreate a chateau. Buy an old one and fix it up and live like that. But feudalism operates very carefully. The feudal lord took care of his people. One of the reasons European social democracy is stronger than its counterpart in the United States is it harkens back to a pre-capitalist time. The feudal lord had to take care of his serfs. That was his obligation. A capitalist has no obligation. He pays you, end of story. Get out of my house after I've paid you. You're not my concern. I don't have to worry about your family. I don't have to worry about your home. I don't have to, nothing. I paid you. Bye. Come here tomorrow. That's not the way feudalism worked. The lord, having sworn to cherish and honor and obey, has obligations. And the European masses have a historical memory of having been taken care of. So they are amenable to a socialist argument saying these capitalists don't care about you, and that has a real reflex, mobilizes workers. They're outraged. Americans are not. They're just not. So in any case, European capitalism grows up in the framework of a very powerful feudalism. America isn't in Europe. It has no feudalism. America might have had a problem with the pre-existing class structures of the American Indians, but it solved that problem by systematic ethnic cleansing. Oh, we didn't call it that, but that's what it is. That's what it was. We killed all those people or stuck them away in reservations. So now we have an immense territory with neither feudalism nor any other earlier class structure. By the way, are there studies of American Indian communities about how they organized the surplus? You bet. And if you're interested, it's a very remarkable story. For example, one of the most well-studied Indian groupings are the Iroquois, a whole group of tribal units in New England, New York, up in that area. They had a very communist class, very collective class structure. Very interesting how they worked out the production and distribution of surplus. Not, of course, in that language, but in a very, and it freaked out the Europeans who first came, who had no conception of what this arrangement was, since it was so different from the feudalism or the new capitalism. Anyway, we killed them all. So we had a capitalism that could grow kind of without hesitance, without hindrance. No Indians left and no European feudals to bother you. Cut off the top. The British tried to impose some feudalism and we made a revolution, get rid of them. Get rid of King George III, etc., etc. So we had a free kind of capitalism. Bizarrely free. But more interesting, having killed off the Indians, capitalism was stymied here, even when it began to grow, for a simple reason. Nobody to work. See, capitalism needs the employer, but it also needs the employee. We had lots of budding employers and none of the employees. So you had to bring people here. There was always a labor shortage. Very important. And because there was always a labor shortage in those areas where capitalism got going, that excludes, of course, the South, which solved its labor problem with slavery. But in the North, growing Midwest, you had a capitalism that in the early part of the 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, after we become an independent nation, it's a capitalism whose continuing labor shortage means that wages are always high. You have to make it worthwhile. Not only for people from Europe to come here and work, but you have the second problem, which is dimly grasped in American history. It's called the problem of the frontier. And it works like this. A worker has to be paid a rising wage because that worker can always run away and get land. Why? Because having killed all the Indians, there's lots of land out there. Just go there, put a stick in the ground, and announce it's yours. That's basically how this was done. And so you always had to worry that your worker would take off and become a farmer because there was lots of good land where she could do it. And it did it. So the wages are high. To make a long story short, from the beginning of the 19th century, roughly 1820, as best we can tell, all the way up to 1970, For 150 years, real wages, the actual amount of goods and services a worker could buy with an hour's worth of pay, kept rising, decade by decade. Amazing. If it is true, then no other capitalist economy has ever delivered that record to its workers. Rising real wages for 150 years. During this time, workers became increasingly more productive. Capitalists worked them harder, gave them more machines, better machines. The productivity of American workers rose. In fact, it rose faster than their wages. So we had a period of 150 years in which the output of goods and service was rising, by the way, on average, about 2% a year, whereas the wages were rising more like 1 to 1.25% a year. Now, in a peculiar way, this is the best of all capitalism. The workers are steadily doing better. The workers in America could begin to believe that they lived in a promised land, in a very special place. Because in terms of what was happening to their real wages, they were right, they did. They could believe, because they were religious, that God had a special place in his or its heart for the United States. Because, wow, many of them were immigrants who came here with great difficulty, leaving their homes, even if their homes were difficult. It was very risky, very expensive. They came in the hopes of a better life, and they got one. And they were grateful. And it created in the American people an affection, a loyalty, a sense of privilege of having to be here, etc., compared to what would happen to people who didn't come here. It also bred in the American psyche a commitment to evaluate yourself in terms of your wages. Because it's probably a natural human desire to choose as a criterion for your own success, for your own worth, something that's going up. It'll make you feel good. If I am as important, if I am as successful, if I am as worthwhile, if I have prestige according to my level of consumption, and I live in a society that gives me more and more wages to enjoy more consumption, I'm going to feel real good about myself. American workers not only got a rising standard of living, but much more important, by itself, that doesn't mean anything. Remember what I told you, the productivity of the worker went up faster. What does that mean? Every year, the worker produced more than the year before. That's what rising productivity means. He produced 2% more, but he only got 1 to 1.25% more. That means the surplus, the difference between what he produced and what he got, was growing even faster than his wages were growing. So over the years, we have the best of all possible capitalism. The workers are getting more, the capitalists are getting more, everybody wins. It's one, wait a minute, wait a think. If the workers getting 1.5% more, but the capitalists are getting a bigger increase every year because productivity is rising, then the gap between workers and capitalists is growing, which it did. Which meant that you had a potential crisis lurking. Because if the worker thinks of himself or herself not in terms of rising wages, but rather their social position and relationship to the capitalists, then the situation of workers in the last 150 years was deteriorating. The gap between them and the rich was getting bigger and bigger. So it was crucial to stave off the danger, the political danger of that, by making sure Americans did not evaluate themselves in relationship worker-capitalist, producer-appropriator of surplus. No such idea should be. No. Instead, an alternative vision. And it works like this. God put us on earth to work. Our job is to work. What is it in the Bible? Sweat of the brow, toil, I forget the language. That's what we're here for, to put out the effort. And the American ideology steps right in. Yeah, that's what God has in mind for you. But there is a compensation. There is a reward for the work you do. It's the consumption that the pay you get makes possible. That the way God organized the world, the way the world is you do something unpleasant, work. But in exchange, you get the opportunity to do something pleasant, shop. 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 In economics that I teach, in conventional economics as just taught in every textbook, you are taught that labor, work, is a disutility. It's the language of economics. That means work is intrinsically, unalterably, inherently awful. It's the opposite of useful, utility. It's disutility. Every hour that you work, you have a greater unpleasant experience. It's called the rising marginal disutility of effort in the textbook. Each hour is more horrific than the one before. Why do you do it? Because for each hour you get the means for happiness in the mall. But it is recognized that each additional wage per hour gives you a little less pleasure. I mean, the first paycheck is really fun in the mall, but the second one not as much fun as the first. So there's a declining marginal utility of income. And so you draw the two lines. The economists are people who never got beyond the third grade intellectually and emotionally. When you are in the third grade, one of your great joys, remember it, was a little exercise. Your parents gave you a little book. It's called Connect the Dots. And there's a bunch of dots, and you draw a line among the dots, and a rabbit appears. Economists are adults who still play lots of dots, and you draw lines. And where the lines crisscross is magic. Wonderful. Whole analysis of the world from the crossing of the lines. In any case, the marginal disutility of effort, offset by the marginal utility of income, explains why people work. This little exercise, taught to every economic student early in his or her career, has a hidden message, which is never discussed by the professor. Work is awful. Money paid for work is the appropriate, the adequate compensation. That's why Americans think, when I go to work,